Yet during World War II, Valentine's Day, I'm aware that fewer than half of all adult Americans are married and partnered. Many people live alone. 28% of all households now, and many by choice. For others, however, Valentine's Day can feel like something of a cruel joke. Love? I don't have one. At weddings, the words we heard from 1 Corinthians are often read. We were supposed to be at a wedding for a nephew last weekend, but the heavens intervened with storms across the country and we couldn't get there. So instead, Gwen and I stayed home and watched the hilarious movie The Princess Bride, which she'd never seen, where the officiant in the wedding says, marriage, love, true love, do you have to win? And then we talked about how Paul's hymn to love, often read at weddings, has little to do with Eros and Valentine's Day, and almost everything to do with what the Greeks called agape, or spiritual love. It reminded me that among all the languages that I've studied trying to emulate my grandfather, English is kind of singular in trying to load so much meaning on one little four-letter word. When I was 16, I became an exchange student in Italy. And in learning that language, I found that while ti amo professes romantic or intimate love, even in a family, even deeper are the words ti voglio bene, which literally translate as, I wish well for you. I wish the best for you. Which, after all, is what all real caring is about, and all the other forms of love. Once when I was first venturing into a pulpit at the ripe age of 24, I chose 1 Corinthians 13 as the reading because my task that morning was to announce to the congregation that was essentially supervising my internship that I was engaged to be married to Gwen. But just before the service, I was introduced by a member of the congregation there outside New York to her brother-in-law, Professor Daniel Day Williams, whom I knew to be one of Union Theological Seminary's most distinguished theologians, and the author of a book called The Spirit and Forms of Love. It's a wonder I got through the sermon, but I did. And oh, was I gratified when Dr. Williams pronounced it good. My classmates in Italy, in Liceo Classico, were doing their 9th year of Latin and their 5th year of Greek. And they knew that Cupid, that little winged angel with a bow, is the Latin version of the Greek god Eros, the myth of which revolves around a little male hunter and the object of his love, the passive princess Psyche, which seems as problematic to me today as it did to our transcendentalist forebear, Margaret Fuller, who asked the women who gathered for her 1839 Conversations for Women how they felt about being treated as mere objects of desire and not as moral agents themselves. She knew that equally, if not more important, was what the Greeks called philia, which is their word for sisterly or brotherly or love or friendship. St. Valentine, by the way, is said to have been a 3rd century priest who was martyred for having defied the authorities by conducting weddings for couples whose love matches were disapproved by their families or the authorities. In that sense, I think I can still like him, or the legend about him. After all, as Anne mentioned, I spent 10 years after my term as UUA president as national co-chair of Freedom to Marry, trying to win equal marriage rights for same-sex couples and the same blessings and protections that Gwen and I have enjoyed. As Dr. King said, justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. By the way, some of the earliest supporters of Freedom to Marry were King's widow, Coretta Scott King, and the late Congressman John Lewis, not to mention Cristina Chavez, the daughter of Cesar Chavez, all of whom bucked prejudices in their own communities to stand for love. We UUs should remember that our social justice efforts now use that phrase, siding with love. It comes out of an event that took place at the church where I was ordained, in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I served my first pastorate in the 1970s. You may recall that on an August Sunday in 2008, when that church was celebrating the completion of an interracial day camp, with the kids about to put on excerpts from the musical Annie at Sunday worship, a hate-filled man appeared with a loaded shotgun hidden in a guitar case, with the goal, as he had expressed it in a note left on the seat of his pickup, to kill as many liberals as possible. And the church treasurer, serving as an usher that day, big man the size of a refrigerator, stepped right in front of it and took the shotgun blast to protect the children, and died. Another usher tackled the assailant, but not before a second blast had killed a visitor and wounded some others, adults, but none of the kids. The police arrived and reporters asked the minister if the church would be seeking the death penalty for the perpetrator. And my successor there, Chris Weiss, replied, "This church has been standing on the side of love since it was founded as the first interracial congregation in this city. And it is not going to stop siding with love now." Which brings me to that story that Anne alluded to about South Africa that involves Bishop Tutu. 4 years ago, the San Francisco UU Church Choir went to South Africa, and Gwen and I went along. Our minister emerita, Margot Gross, had spent her sabbatical there a few years before, establishing a spiritual partnership between our community and a community of poor women in a township called Kopanang. She had gone there on sabbatical and worked with a Dominican nun named Sheila Flynn, tending the widows and orphans left behind when so many of the husbands and fathers, having gone off to work elsewhere, came back with sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV/AIDS. Before we flew to Africa, Gwen and I stopped to see our family in Boston, where our younger daughter lives, and belongs to a congregation that included Victor Carpenter, who once been the minister in San Francisco, and before that, the minister in Cape Town during the late 1960s, until the apartheid government expelled him and his family for supporting liberation and ending apartheid. Victor had, as I well knew, then tapped a journalist in the congregation named Bob Steer, to take some training for the ministry and become essentially the lay minister, writing a column still for the most progressive newspaper in South Africa, in its most progressive city. I called on Victor in Boston, knowing that he was dying of cancer. The tour was a fabulous experience. It included such things as a workshop with the all-black, world-renowned Soweto Gospel Choir. When we arrived in Cape Town, Gwen and I had dinner with the Honorable and Reverend Gordon Oliver and his wife Sheila, who works as a nurse in the Black Townships. Gordon earned his titles because he became vice mayor of Cape Town in the early 1990s as a white progressive, and then was asked who would be the mayor's chaplain, and opened the city council meetings with reflection, meditation, and prayer. Although raised in Christianity, Gordon, like Cindy, had become more of a spiritual seeker, recognizing how often rigid doctrines that distorted human equality had come to infect his childhood faith. But he knew about Bob Steer's columns, and so went to the Unitarian Church to hear him. Decided to join, and then appointed Steer as chaplain to the city council. When Archbishop Tutu called for a peaceful, loving protest against a one-race election, one in which only whites could vote, Gordon and his new minister led the entire city council in following Bishop Tutu. 30,000 citizens of Cape Town followed. The white nationalist government then realized that they had lost the support of the country's second most important city, and under pressure from international boycotts, decided to free Nelson Mandela from prison on Robben Island and negotiate with the African National Council. Gordon, by then mayor, was the man who welcomed Mandela to Cape Town City Hall and stood next to him as he addressed from the balcony of that government building a crowd of about 100,000, promising that the future in South Africa would not be one of revenge, but rather one of truth-telling and efforts at reconciliation. Efforts which, of course, when he became president of South Africa, he appointed Bishop Tutu to lead. Two years ago, in this country, after the death of George Floyd and the realization that the pandemic was only deepening the divide between haves and have-nots, and those privileged by skin color and those discriminated against by it, we began a long overdue process of racial reckoning. That, too, I want to say, is a form of love. There are many things that need to be reconciled in this broken nation of ours. Anger can be, and always has been, a legitimate form of love when it faces rank injustice. But back in the 1990s, I'm reminded, the Irish band U2, decrying the violence between Protestants and Catholics in their own country, wrote a song about love with the refrain, "She moves in mysterious ways." It was never clear whether they were referring to an earthly lover or a transcendent love with a capital L, moving in ways mysterious to us all. And when asked, they steadfastly refuse to answer, which I think is wise of them. I choose the latter interpretation because, as it says elsewhere in Scripture, and as I've said myself this morning, before any of us can learn to love or act in love, it would be wise for us to recognize that we were first loved, and beyond our deserving, beyond any deserving. That, I must say, fits with my own empirical observation of human beings through 50 years of ministry. The human love we receive may be quite imperfect. What else could it be, since we are imperfect? But surely those who say that they love God and then go on to hate are, as Scripture also says, lying to themselves. For if we do not love others whom we have seen, how can we claim to also love the Spirit that loved us all into being, whom we have never seen directly at all? All faiths, I think, affirm this. The great Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who also died this past winter, once put it this way: in the papers, they don't publish the good news. They print only what is wrong. The good news is that the dandelion is there by the sidewalk, smiling its wondrous smile, singing the song of eternity. Listen, you have ears to hear it. The good news is that someone needs you, is there before you, and your arms and your love are available. The good news is published daily, but it is published by us. Friday morning at 4:30 a.m., those words came to me as I listened to the news while walking between my home in the city and the UU church, where I was to work alongside my daughter and granddaughter, making breakfast for 60 homeless guests in our interfaith winter shelter. I was especially glad to be next to my granddaughter, who is 14, and like many sensitive teenagers, has had a hard time emotionally during this pandemic. Bombarded with all of the bad news of the wider world, including wars and rumors of wars, and the reality of a threatened planet and climate. Without preaching to her, here is what I wanted to say. As Rabbi Jesus put it, the first and greatest commandment is to love the very ground of our being. To be grateful, to be alive, and to have been loved in the life. To trust that the creative process that we never can fully understand, that does move in mysterious ways, brought us here, but is still ongoing, with a future that we can help to shape, even amid all the challenges and the losses. It calls us to remember that our forebears, like my grandparents, were wise enough to show that love. So if we want to love the earth, to love our vulnerable sisters and brothers, to love the human future, to make it better for succeeding generations, we need first to practice that spiritual form of love called gratitude each day. Sure, we also need some loving outrage against selfish and short-sighted thinking. But most of all, we need to love the simple fact that we are here at all, alive and loved often beyond our awareness or understanding. That is spiritual love, my friends, which precedes and upholds our love for others. It takes cultivation. It takes coming together in community, in worship, to be reminded. It takes conscious daily spiritual practice, whatever form you may find best serves your soul. May we each find our own unique path to deepening that spiritual love in our own lives. It's not a Hallmark greeting card, but it is the love, the other form of love, that truly matters, not just on Sundays, but with each new day dawning. So may it be.